recognize that they have a good spirit and a desire to serve God and to follow God. I think that's such a wonderful thing, you know. So, as we said, I was got to go rode the bus with the Saints there from Louisiana, and you know it was just a good experience. It's just like being with you all, you know, just good fellowship and you know things along the way up on the road, stopping and eating whatever we done, you know, do together, and had an enjoyable time. And so there's a lot of good and a lot of good to see people, you know, and that have a desire to see the gospel go forward. Because we don't want our work and the Lord to be hindered. You know, we have enough hindrances in this world, you know, than to let the enemy bring things in among us, you know, that would hinder us. But I thank God that we have a desire to just to be faithful to God. And what we're going to be studying on, I appreciate Brother Danny filling in those couple Sundays I wasn't able to be here. And but, you know, it's always, you know, you go to a camp meeting or something, and it just starts winding down, and you know, and sometimes, you know, you think about, well, got to go out into they say the real world, you know, where you about back to your job, out into the world, you know, realize that what is out there. But, you know, I thank God that we can have great times of refreshing. And I know we need that, you know, to refresh one another, to be encouraged. So we're going to be looking maybe for the next few weeks. What I have here is the thought is suffering for Christ. You know, suffering for Christ. You know, that kind of sounds to, you know, some people that would sound like, well, that's kind of a morbid thought, but, you know, it's really not when we begin to think about it. And people may think, well, what caused, you know, as I think about that, about suffering things for Christ. We know the Bible does tell us that, and maybe we can't really comprehend that sometime. You know, about why, and people ask the question, may even ask you the question, why does God allow us to suffer? You know, why do we have to suffer things sometime just like the world? You know, the world suffers a lot of things too, and we suffer a lot of things they suffer. They suffer a lot of things we suffer. So that's just a part of life. You know, we will suffer. But, you know, it's how we bear under those things. That's where our witness is. You know, there's people out in the world suffer some things, and they don't take it too good. You know, they're not a good witness. They don't bear up under those things. But, you know, I was thinking about that when we suffer for Christ. You know, that is a witness in itself. You know, that's a witness in itself. And even Brother Paul, you know, he had whatever he suffered, you know, at thorn in the flesh. Is, you know, some people talk about different things about that. But, you know, it was something he didn't really want to go through. Does anybody like to suffer? No, we don't like to suffer. You know, but sometimes people can get a lot of ideas about suffering for Christ. You know, there's been people you read down through history, done a lot of things they counted as suffering, but was not really suffering at all. What was the point? Did God get glory out of it? You know, we read about people that, you know, would just go off into the caves and do all these things, take these whips and whip themselves, or wear some kind of a garment under the other garment was like with you know, like some kind of barbed metal, or camels just rough hair or something, you know, just to make their own self suffer. You know, that's not suffering for Christ. He don't get any glory out of that. If we cut ourselves or hurt our bodies or do things, you know, that's just hurting our flesh. You know, if we suffer, the Bible, we'll read that later on, it says, if any man suffer what? As a Christian. You know, we don't have to hurt our own bodies. You know, I was reading about, you know, you read about people that really, you know, they're seeking after God, and they want to please God, and sometime in their mind and their thoughts, you know, how would we feel if one of our children, to prove their love to us, hurt their own bodies, or you know, in that thought, that would not make a whole lot of common sense with it. So we find that if we are serving God, if we're true Christians, we don't have to seek after something to suffer for. We will suffer. And you may think, well, and sometimes when we think about suffering, we think about pain, we think about affliction. But, even if everything's going seemingly good physically, yet we still suffer some things as a Christian. It might not be physical abuse, but we suffer sometimes things by just the life we live. We may suffer. It's just so many things that we may suffer just by being the people of God. And as we said, the Christian suffers many things the world in general suffer. What are things that the Christian suffers? We carry loads, we shed tears, we do all these things. And as we said, some people torture their own selves. That's vain religion. That's not pleasing to God. They're not looking unto Jesus, are they? They're looking to some other a source to their own self. And I was reading about, I read there was this religious group, I forget exactly what they called them, but they would go barefooted wherever they went, in the snow, in the cold, on the rocks. Did God require that of them to suffer? I don't think so. I don't think it's God's will. I remember reading about Martin Luther, that he was seeking after God, and he thought that maybe to abase himself, to humble himself, so, that he would go out and lay in the snow. And said, and later on he wrote, said, I probably would eventually have died if they had not, just come and picked him up and brought him in or whatever. He was in such maybe agony of spirits trying to draw close to God. But, God didn't require, he didn't have to torture himself in the cold and all that. It's not what it's all about. But, it is giving ourselves, be willing to suffer, as Brother Paul said, that he sought after that and, asked to be relieved from that, but God, Christ told him his grace would be sufficient. I think I was thinking about from the very beginning, I don't think I've ever heard the thought, but this thought came to me, that man who was created in the image of God was not created to suffer. God didn't make man to suffer. I can't read, I don't get any of that in the first and second chapter of Genesis. What do you read into that when you read the first chapter and the second chapter of Genesis? I don't read anything about suffering. I don't read anything about sorrow. I don't read anything about shame. None of those things. I find it was like the Bible says, the Garden of Eden. Man was in the presence of God. He knew no sorrow, knew no pain, knew none of those things. But God created, he didn't create man, I don't believe, to suffer. And maybe that's why it's hard for us to sometimes to fathom that. Or maybe we'll ask the question, why do we have to suffer? And then we'll say, well, even as Christians, why do we have to suffer? And the more we think of it, the more we look into it, we realize that, it's can be for the glory of God, because, that is a witness in itself. How do we bear up under our suffering? People can suffer, but do we suffer as a Christian with a Christ-like spirit? People can suffer out a lot of things, but if we're murmuring and complaining, that's not a good witness. That's not suffering as a Christian. How's a Christian going to suffer? Well, we're going to be able to bear under these things, and sometimes I know it's hard to focus on that. Have you ever had to go through something, and the thought would be in your mind, well, it'll work for the good, and you maybe in your mind, well, there's no way this can work for the good. Have you ever had that thought? Well, I have. You say, well, how? Just no way. I know the Bible says, and I believe it, but this might be a little different. No, if we suffer as a Christian, it says, let him not be ashamed, but let him glorify God on this behalf. But the thought is, and the key says, if any man suffer as a Christian. Now, if you suffer because of something you've done that's not Christ-like, well, that's another thing. But to suffer as a Christian, suffer because of righteousness' sake, suffer because of good, that's when God can get the glory. That's when it's a witness for Him. So in our suffering, and even if it's in just day-to-day life, we suffer things that other people suffer. I think about that. Things that the world suffer, I suffer. There's a lot of things that happens out there. In the book of Job, we read about those things. The world, they have loved ones that die. They have calamities. People in the world, their houses burn down. Our houses can burn down. They can have a wreck. We can have a wreck. They can lose a job. We can lose a job. So there's a lot of things that the world suffers that we suffer too. But, through all of that, we need to be set apart. We need to set the example that Christ set before us, to give God the glory, not, to bear under it, as a witness, about grace and the love of God, what He can do for us. We'll be looking over in 1 Peter, the 4th chapter. So as we said, I don't think that man was not created to suffer pain, afflictions, and distresses, and all the various sufferings, even the Christian suffers. So as we go back, we talk about in the book of Genesis, and we find that, as we said, I don't see anywhere there that God intended His creation, to suffer. We think about it, man just had so much that God gave him. All, even the trees of the field, the fruit, the ground, it was to bring forth, and man was to enjoy his labor. And the woman was to, I believe, bear children. But later on it says, and sorrow. There was no doubt God had a plan, even in childbearing, that would have been, it just wouldn't been as it is, as we know it is. But, as sin entered into the world, that's when a lot of suffering began, when a lot of sorrow began. And that's the way it is even today, in people's lives. We see sin always brings sorrow, it brings regret. And we can just trace it all the way back to the beginning. And where did suffering enter into the world? Maybe we could look back to that later. But we may think it's strange, about unexplainable, why we must suffer. Have you ever thought about that? Well, maybe even the next week or two, if you want to participate, and maybe write down some ways that you have suffered. You don't have to put your name. You can if you want to. But, think about maybe something you suffered and you didn't understand. And and then later on, you're seeing that God used that. And that might be an encouragement to others. As we said sometime, we think about that. And I've seen people suffer things, and I thought, man, I hope I don't ever have to suffer that. How did they do that? How did they bear under that? Well, God's grace will be there. But, we may ask that question, or people may ask that of us. And, we want to be able to help them. Sometimes we can't, if somebody walked up to you right now and said, why do Christians have to suffer? Sometimes you may have to give it a lot of thought. We think about that. We may think it's strange. We may not can explain it. And may even be tempted to think it not just and right that we as Christians suffer. Have you ever, that may come to your mind that it's just not right. Well, in the sight of God, He allows those things to happen. He allows us to be tried. He allows us to be tempted. But, when we're tempted, when we're tried, when we suffer these things, it glorifies God if we give Him glory. If we hold fast, if we don't let any bitterness or a route or any of those things. I think this has helped me more, and I believe it'll help everybody. I believe that helps. That's what helps us as Christians, to know that, I want to manifest Christ in this, show the glory of God, show what, if we suffer, whatever it may be, for the glory of God. We will suffer a lot of things. And I know, no doubt some in here have suffered various things, and you continue to suffer. But, when we see and when God looks at us and we're just staying faithful, staying true, He'll bless our lives. Let's look in First Peter, the 4th chapter. We may read pretty much the whole chapter, but this is a good chapter. I think about, it's almost to be called about suffering and a lot of things. It's got a lot of good verses. It says, "For as much then as Christ has suffered for us in the flesh, arm yourselves likewise with the same mind. For he that suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin, and he should no longer live the rest of his time in the flesh to the lust of men, but to the will of God. For the time past of our life may suffice us to have wrought the will of the Gentiles when we walked in lasciviousness, lust, excess of wine, revelings, banquetings, and abominable idolatries, wherein they think it strange that you run not with them to the same excess of riot, speaking evil of you, who shall give account to him that is ready to judge the quick and the dead. For this cause was the gospel preached also to them that are dead, that they might be judged according to men in the flesh, but live according to God in the Spirit. But the end of all things is at hand. Be therefore sober and watch unto prayer. And above all things have fervent charity among yourselves, for charity shall cover the multitudes of sin." Okay, and it says, "Use hospitality one to another without grudging. As every man has received a gift, so minister the same one to another as good stewards of the manifold grace of God. If any man speak, let him speak as the oracles of God. If any man minister, let him do it as the ability which God giveth, that God in all things may be glorified through Jesus Christ, to whom be praise and dominion forever and ever. Amen." It says, "Beloved, think it not strange concerning the fiery trial which is to try you, as though some strange thing happened unto you, but rejoice, inasmuch that you're partakers of Christ's suffering, that when his glory shall be revealed, you may be glad also with exceeding joy." So it says, shouldn't think it strange. We may ask sometime, "Why me, Lord? Why?" Have you asked why? Well, sometime in our own humanity, sometime we will think that. Why? Why this suffering? How can you get glory out of this? And many things we can't explain. But it says what? To suffer for Christ, suffer with Christ, or for the glory of Christ. Verse 14 says, "If you be reproached for the name of Christ, happy are ye, for the Spirit of glory and of God resteth upon you. On their part he is evil spoken of, but on your part he is glorified." So it says, if you be reproached for the name of Christ, how much do we love Christ? How much do we love him? How's our walk with him? I was thinking last night about going way back. In the book of Genesis, we read about Enoch. We read about Noah, and it says that these men walked with God. And we know it means more than just walking down the road, but what they had communion with God. They walked with God, and I was just wondering even about Enoch. I believe the only other place that I remember that it's spoken about, or that the Bible speaks about Enoch, was there, maybe in Jude, but it says Enoch, the seventh from Adam, prophesied. So even in his day, was there evil all the way back, wasn't it? Just wasn't very long after Adam and Eve, when they sinned, and then we find Cain slew Abel, and then it wasn't much time. Sin grows rapidly, don't it? It don't sit idle. it grows fast. It goes fast. So from the very beginning, even up to the time of Noah, it says that God saw that the imagination of man's heart was on evil continually. And I believe these men, and I've often heard it said about Noah, and the Bible doesn't say, but we always read well about people, no doubt, making fun of Noah or didn't understand, and I'm sure they did. The Bible doesn't say, but a lot of people, heard different people think that, and I believe no doubt it was so. As Noah was out, working on the ark, and the Bible called him a preacher of righteousness. So I'm sure he warned, I'm sure. And in our mind, we can only imagine, just by thinking, I'm sure it was that way. I believe he had to suffer reproach, but he didn't let that stop him, because, he had a command of God, to do this. And he knew that if he was to save himself and his family and the generations, no doubt, to come, he kept working, he kept laboring, because he knew he had a focus, he had a job to do. So as we suffer reproach, have you ever been reproached for the name of Christ? Have you ever had to suffer? And I'm saying a lot of times that we may not be in our country, in our society, we have laws, we have all those things that I believe prevent a lot of things from happening. We may not be physically abused, but sometimes we do suffer reproach. We suffer what people say. Sometimes they will do us wrong. They will take advantage of us, or as Christians. And sometimes those things that people say against us or do against us, those can be hurtful too. But it doesn't matter ever how we suffer as a people. Whatever way it is, we need to suffer for Christ. Manifest Christ, manifest His power. That how is it that you can suffer? How is it that you can love someone that does you wrong? That don't sit too well with the world. They don't understand that. They want to take vengeance, because that is the way of the world. But it says, if you suffer reproach for the name of Christ, what it says, happy are ye. How can you be happy when you're suffering? Well, there is a way. If we stay focused, and the Word tells us, we may read that later, said, if you do wrong and suffer for it, there's no glory in that. But if you suffer for righteousness' sake, if you suffer these things, and we know the Word does tell us in another scripture that they that live godly will suffer persecutions. So, there's two forces at work. There's good and there's evil. And, they are opposed to each other. When you do good, evil is going to go against that. So we'll suffer a lot of things as a Christian, for His sake, when we live for God. Verse 15. Well, let me read 14 again. It says, but if you be reproached for the name of Christ, happy are ye, for the Spirit of glory and of God resteth upon you. On their part he is evil spoken of, but on your part he is glorified. But let none of you suffer as a murderer, or as a thief, or as an evildoer, or as a busybody in other men's matters. I don't want to suffer that way. What does it mean to suffer? If you suffer, what's a murderer? Well, he's going to suffer. He may be put up. He might be, put on death row. Or it says, or as a thief. If a thief is caught, he suffers. Well, there's no glory in that. You got caught. There's no glory in all those things. As Christians, we don't have to worry. Brother Charlie, we're not, I'm not worrying about Brother Charlie going to be caught tomorrow as a thief. And you may say, oh, I'm suffering. I said, well, we will suffer. Our people suffer as a murderer, as a thief, or as an evildoer, or as a busybody in other men's matters. As Christians, we're not to suffer those things, because that's not who we are. That's not the Spirit of Christ. We're not to suffer, and we won't if we're people of God. We don't have to worry about suffering for those things. But it says, yet, if any man suffer as a Christian, You know, he didn't say you wouldn't suffer. He said, yeah, if any man suffer as a Christian. As a Christian, we're not busybodies. We're not thieves. We're not murderers. But yeah, it does imply here that we will suffer. You know, we're not going to suffer because of those things. But what does it mean to suffer as a Christian? It says, if any man suffer as a Christian, you know, now if we're a thief or we're a murderer or something like that, then that would be shame. You know, have you ever seen these people that are arrested because they're murdered or a thief or been caught? You know, when they go on camera, what they're trying to hide, you know, hide their face or, you know, trying to not to be seen. But it says, if any man suffer as a Christian, how are we supposed to do? I believe God would let us, hold our head up. And we're not proud, but we're glad, you know, as a witness, and we're living for Christ. It said if we suffer as a Christian, we don't have to be ashamed. You know, let's not be ashamed. I don't ever want to be ashamed. You know, sometimes people don't understand us. Why do you do this? Why do you don't do that? Well, I don't have to hide my head in shame, but if I can, in my heart and my mind, know that I have done what is good and what is right, I don't have to be ashamed of that. Have you ever had to suffer for Christ? I know you have. We don't have to be ashamed of that. You know, we can testify and tell people, this is the reason I do these things. This is the reason I don't do those things. You know, somebody recently was talking about at a place I was at, and they was talking about the lust of the flesh, more or less. They was talking about men and women, you know, and how they do and how they look and all of this, and just going on, and you know, about that. And I was talking about like everybody does it, or, you know, just shopping around, whatever. But I told a person, I said, you know, well, you know, I said people, I said you can be tempted, but I said that is where the power of Christ can be manifest. You know, so I thank God that we can let people know, you know, we're not of the world. You know, we don't follow after those things. We may be tempted, we may be tried, but, you know, that person just kind of really didn't know what to say. But I thank God that I wasn't ashamed. I wasn't ashamed of the gospel. I wasn't going down that road. I wasn't going partaking of the things of the world because they can say what they want. No, not everybody goes that route. No, not everybody lives that way. And we can't do it within our own self, but when we can magnify Christ and said, you know, that's where the power of God, that's where the power of Christ comes in, that we don't have to do those things. You know, we don't have to be that way. And that's part of suffering a little bit of reproach. You know, when you're separated from the crowd, you know, when there's a crowd of people sometime, have you ever had to just step back? Yeah, you step back. And you'll be tempted, you know, to stay and, you know, not to be singled out. But sometimes we do that, not with pride or malice or anything, but we realize, hey, this is not for me. I got to step back, get away from that, you know, and stand for what is good. And so that's part of our suffering for Christ, and we willingly do it because we want to, you know, we want the gospel to be brought forth. We want people to see the life that Christ has for us and what great joy it is to serve him, even when we suffer. Thank the Lord. Appreciate y'all, saints.